Hello, welcome to the first of a series of 3 programs on the settlement of Mauritius. Only during the last 360 years or so have men lived on our island. Before that time, Mauritius had no inhabitants but only visitors. The first ones may have been the Phoenicians, original inhabitants of Lebanon, followed by the Malays, many of whom migrated to Madagascar. Later came the Arabs, who were trading in the Indian Ocean and who had strong and well-built vessels called dodos. Among the Europeans who visited our island were the Portuguese, who wanted to participate in the profitable spice trade. Just like the earlier visitors, they did not settle in Mauritius, but they brought pigs, goats, monkeys and cattle from Madagascar and left them on the island. The idea behind it was that when they would stop occasionally on the island on their way to and from the east, they would obtain food. Unfortunately, they also brought rats. Many ships contained rats, some of which swam on land whenever a ship anchored at the bay. The Portuguese gave the name of Siane to the island. The first people to start a settlement in Mauritius were the Dutch, who were equally active traders in the Indian Ocean. The main reason for settling here was to prevent the French and the English from using the island on their way to India and the East Indies. However, the Dutch abandoned the settlement in 1710, after having depleted the forests of their ebony trees, their main source of revenue, and after having killed the dodos. The real settlement of our island started with the French, who by 1674 had already settled in Bourbon, that is, Réunion Island. It was the French main base in the Indian Ocean and the port of call for its ship on the voyage to the trading post at Pondichéry in India. And the first batch of French settlers in 1721 came from Bourbon. Despite their presence in Bourbon, the French settled in Mauritius because of its 2 natural harbours at Port Louis and Grand Port, while Bourbon had no safe harbours. They named our island Île-de-France. Moreover, pirates were using Mauritius as a hiding place, and they were a danger for the French ships in the Indian Ocean. If the French could settle in Mauritius, the pirates would not be able to use the island anymore. The early French settlers, just like the Dutch before, led a very hard life. Thus, before the arrival of La Bourdonnais in 1734, the French settlement can be considered as having been a failure. So, to encourage French people to come to Île-de-France, land grants of 156 1/4 arpents were given to settlers, but with 2 main conditions. Firstly, the settlers were given 3 years to clear and cultivate the land with food crops, spices, fruit trees, sugarcane and medicinal plants. Secondly, after the 3 years, 1/10 of the harvest would go to the company. Note that until 1767, Île-de-France was under the control of the French East India Company, which was actively involved in the trade of spices in the Indian Ocean. As the French colonists were too few in number and they found it hard to work in the fields, they had recourse to slave labor. The word slave refers to a person who is treated as the property of another person, company, or government. The slave cannot leave his master without a written permission. Let us find out more about the origin of the slaves, or to put it more clearly, from where did the slaves of Île-de-France come from? They were brought from West Africa, East Africa, Madagascar, India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The average percentage for each group established by various authorities for the 18th century is as follows. Mozambican slaves, between 40 and 45%. Malagasy slaves, between 30 and 40%, and Indian slaves between 10 and 15%. The majority of the slaves came from Mozambique and Madagascar because of the nearness to our country. It is to be noted here that the transport of slaves on board the slave vessels has been regarded as the worst aspect of slavery. Traveling conditions were so inhuman that the death rate among the slaves on board of the ships was very high. Apart from the slaves in Ile-de-France, there was also a voluntary group of people consisting of free people involved in non-agricultural jobs. Indian sailors of Muslim faith settled in the island and were employed to replace those French sailors who fell sick or died on their voyage. Tamil artisans also came from India, mainly from Pondicherry. They were skilled workers such as masons and carpenters, and they were employed in the construction of various buildings located in Port Louis. Later, there were also other skilled workers who came from Madagascar at the end of the 18th century. All these various groups of people mixed freely and indiscriminately with the slave population. Let us now consider the conditions of the slaves. The slaves had to obey special laws called the Code Noir. These laws were in force in all French colonies. Let us have a look at a few articles of the Code Noir. Article 22.
Masters shall be obliged to provide each week to their slaves of 18 years old or more for food, 2½ measures of cassava flours, or 3 cassavas weighing 2½ pounds each at least, or some equivalent provisions with 2 pounds of salt beef or 3 pounds of fish or some equal value, and to children weaning until 10 years, half the above subsistence.
From this, we find that slaves were guaranteed their food supplies, a condition that was also in the interest of the slave owner. In fact, a malnourished slave is weak and unproductive. Article 27.
We declare that slaves may own nothing which does not belong to their masters, and everything which they receive from their work or through gift of other people shall be regarded as the property of their masters.
A slave did not have the right to own anything. In fact, slaves were considered not as human beings, but as goods or furniture. Article 38.
Runaway slaves who have been missing for a month, the day when their master reported to the justice, shall have their ears cut and shall be branded with the fleur de lis on one shoulder. If they run away for another month, and the third time, they shall be punished until death.
Note that the slave was put to death only after his third attempt at escaping, because the master had bought the slaves, and killing him meant a loss of money to the owner. Moreover, the colony was in great need of slaves. The slaves who ran away from the estates to the woods were called maroon slaves. Why did they desert their masters? The obvious reason is that they were ill-treated and tortured by their masters, and their living conditions were very harsh and difficult. It is for this reason that nowadays slavery is considered as the greatest crime against humanity. However, we have to bear in mind that some masters were very kind and sensible towards their slaves. Among them was Charles Telfair. On his estate in Belle-Ombre, the slaves lived in clean and well-built shelters, were fed regularly and sufficiently, were instructed in religion, and they worked respectable hours according to their physical capacity. Another aspect of slavery in our country is that not all slave owners were white. A few among them were non-white. In the district of Flac, for example, there were 148 white landowners who owned 41,956 acres of land. There was also 152 non-whites who possessed 3,598 acres. Both the white and the non-white landowners owned slaves. Of course, the white landowners possessed more slaves as they needed more labor force to work on their bigger portions of land. Every year, the 1st of February is a public holiday in our country to commemorate the abolition of slavery. In this context, a slave route monument near Le Mont Brabant mountain was inaugurated on 1st February 2009 to emphasize the important role played by the slaves in the development of our country. Moreover, Le Mont Brabant mountain forms part of the World Cultural Heritage, since the mountain was one of the places where the runaway slaves took refuge. As the environment was inaccessible, they could not be easily captured. What were the events leading to the abolition of slavery? Before the slaves were set free in 1835, the British abolished slavery, that is, buying and selling of slaves in all its colonies. Consequently, after our country became a British colony, slave trade became illegal. But the slave owners were opposed to the law, since they badly needed new slaves to replace those who had died on the estates. In fact, death rate among the slaves was very high due to their harsh living conditions. Therefore, the slave trade was carried out illegally. So, quite often, captured slaves from slave ships were liberated and they settled in Rodrigues. This explains why Rodrigues has a high percentage of its population of African origin. For several decades, the Anti-Slavery Society in England fought to pass laws to free the slaves without giving any compensation to the planters who owned the slaves. Fearing that the British government might agree to the demands of the Anti-Slavery Society, the planters sent Adrien d'Épinay, a French planter, as their spokesman to England to justify the necessity of paying them a compensation in exchange for the liberation of their slaves. In August 1833, the law abolishing slavery was passed by the British government and came in force to Mauritius in 1835. The planters, on their part, received a compensation of £2 million for the release of their slaves. According to the law, all registered slaves became known as apprentices or apprenticed labourers, and the period of apprenticeship of such labourers would terminate on 1st February 1839 or 1st February 1841, depending on the nature of their work. Such apprentice labourers were compelled by law to work for their masters until their full liberation. Many went to settle and work in Port-Louis. Others settled in coastal villages of Tamarin, Rivière-Noire and Casse-Noyal, where they could get their living by fishing or by doing other jobs. Some even bought land and became market gardeners. Who replaced the slaves on the sugar estate then? Indian labourers were brought to work here. You will learn more about Indian immigrants in our next program. In this program, we have learned that Mauritius was first settled by the Dutch. The Dutch started a settlement in Mauritius and they abandoned it afterwards. Under the French rule, the island depended largely on slave labour for its development. Slaves were brought from East Africa, Madagascar, India, Malaysia and Indonesia and were unjustly treated. They were governed by special laws called the Code Noir. The abolition of slavery in 1835 was the result of the campaigns made by the Anti-Slavery Society in England. After the period of apprenticeship came to an end, the majority of the slaves left their masters. We have come to the end of our program. We hope that it has been of some help to you. Until next time, it's goodbye from us.